Hello, hello. How's it going?
Hi.
A little nervous at first. That's how almost all of these start out. That's okay.
That is a great startup line for a bot. Just like, wow, nice.
I know, right? It's very much in your face.
Okay.
Now, let's just dive right into what your inspirations are. You're a writer, so in that medium, where do you find the things that most inspire you to write your own stuff?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, yes, I'm a writer. I'm better known as Literate Gamer in most of the places I go in. That's my official publishing moniker per se. Regarding the topic of inspiration, that is a very tough question to answer for a lot of artists. But
That's why I always jump right into it with that one, is because it is a tough one.
it is a good conversation starter though. Usually my inspiration mostly comes from the media I consume, as well as sometimes I pull it from dreams, sometimes I pull it from when I'm walking down the street and I think something or I see something. As a writer, it's mostly you grab things from the real world or things that you see from the real world and you translate them into paper as closely as you can, while still giving them like that little tinge of goody juiceness, you know? Like you have to grab something and enhance its features in order for it to be both relatable, but at the same time completely alien.
That makes sense. And in some ways, you even have to simplify something down so that it can be better understood.
Oh yeah, especially when it comes to science fiction, like science fiction and some types of fantasy writing, especially when it deals with dealing with magic systems and scientific systems. You need to know when to simplify, when to overcomplicate, when to hold it just right. It's quite a mess.
I have so many questions about magic systems because that is something that I'm deeply in love with. When I read a book, especially in the fantasy genre, if the magic system is a soft magic system, I'm just not interested. What's your opinion on that? What kind of things do you prefer? Do you prefer to lay everything out and set the basis for more of a hard magic system, or do you like to keep things vague and let people do the imagining for themselves?
It's it highly depends on the type of story I'm writing, because certain stories benefit more from soft magic systems than they do from hard magic systems. An example would be like, let's say Harry Potter is a really good example of like a really big franchise that doesn't really have a hard magic system, but
Very soft. Hardly
yeah,
makes
but
sense.
yeah, it doesn't make sense. It's all over the place. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The spells are inconclusive, but at the same time, it kind of serves towards the story. So, there's not a problem with it, especially because the story doesn't focus on it. Whereas you have something like D&D, where it's a hardcore magic system where every single rule is laid out. You have, in order to evoke a simple spell, you need to have the incantation memorized, you need to have the spell components, you need to have the right material, the right whatever. It largely depends on what kind of story you want to make. So, for example, if you want to make a rather light story that the reader is supposed to like come and go from, you make a soft magic system. If you want to make a story, or you want to have a world that's really well built, then you need to have a hard magic system, because then if the rules are laid out, then the user can start coming up with new things to implement into it. The thing is that there are some times that you can kind of bridge the gap between the two and have sort of a hard magic system that's applied softly. An example that I can think of this would be probably JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, because the rules of JoJo, the rules of stands, are laid out very clearly, but the way that the author writes them is they're very soft, like they can change on a whim. But the thing is, it serves the story, so there's no real issue, save the fan base grabs it and starts deconstructing it, and even then, the fan base usually builds upon it, which is why people find the concept of quirks or superpowers or stands so interesting.
Yeah, because everybody can take what they see being built and kind of run it through their own imagination and come up with something based off of the rules that were laid out. That makes sense.
Yeah, which is something
So
you
in
always want to
your
do as a writer.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, you want to take everything and run it through your own inspirational.
Yeah,
What do you?
you want to
I want
build
to say
your fan
monologue, but
base.
that's the wrong word. Yeah,
It's kind of
absolutely.
like running it through your own personal grinder, and then it comes off as a firm pace for
That's
everyone else to
that's what I
use.
was trying to say. Nailed it.
Yeah.
Um, so in that, now I've talked to a lot of different kinds of artists. I haven't had an opportunity to talk to a writer about this though. Where do you find your consumer base? I mean, how do you get yourself out there? What kind of platforms and utilities do you use to gain a name for yourself?
Oh, that is such a mess for writers, especially because unlike most other forms of artists, writers don't really have like a mainstream platform to go in. The main platforms that I can think of, like when I think writing, are WordPress, Wattpad, fanfiction.net, and Archive of Our Own, like other forum type things. The thing is, the latter two are largely frowned upon because they're considered fanfiction sites, which I can rant about that all day. And the first two are so oversaturated with a lot of writers that want to strike into the business that they kind of get lost in translation, and the mainstream audience only really grabs a couple of things from them. So like what I use a couple of different sites. I mainly use Discord. Though at the moment I've mostly been using Discord. I use Archive of Our Own to publish myself. I'm
I've been
looking
teaching
to
Discord to everybody. It is such a beautiful utility no matter what it is you're into. It's got a
yeah.
stigma to it because of the gaming aspect, but if you do away with that, this is such a perfect platform for communicating.
Oh yeah, it's a great platform. The only issue I would mostly put with Discord is the fact that finding servers, unless you have like the specific Discord bot, is pretty hard. So like, but that's also good because that means that Discord bases itself around networking a lot. So like
Absolutely, yeah.
most of the sites that artists use, for the most part, a lot of writers use Reddit. Um, there's a couple of subreddits that hire freelance writers. The only issue is that if you want to do creative content, like if you want to do a creative writing where you write, scripts, stories, novellas, all that kind of business, if you want to get into that kind of stuff, then it's even harder to get into the marketplace because most people are looking when they think a writer, they think a ghostwriter or they think a research type person that writes articles and blog posts, when usually a lot of writers just want to write their books and write stories for people. I mostly work in as a creative writer. I can work in pretty much anything. I can do translations, I can do script work, I can do revisions, I can do proofreading, I can do copywriting, I can do research papers. But the thing that I like the most to do is I like to create content. So like I have a couple of published works. I've been hired by a couple of companies to create scripts for them. And sadly, pretty much all of them are under NDA, so I can't really get into them or show them,
That's
which
fine.
kind of hurts the
Now let's
portfolio.
hold on. Let's on a side note talk about that then. Let's not talk about the NDAs. Obviously, there's certain things that you can't mention as far as the
Uh-huh.
projects go. But how do you go about as a writer breaking into that and getting those things so that you can or having the opportunity to do those projects?
The way I saw it come for me is it's based on two things. Number one, that your portfolio, it doesn't need to be big, but it has to be impressive. So you need to show your skills out front. So the first thing you need to do to break into the space is you need to be extremely confident in yourself, and you need to market yourself like your pancakes. Like you need to go out there and talk to everyone who will listen and say, hey, you want to hire me? Hey, you want to read this work? Hey, I've been working on this, I've been working on that. Maybe not be like overbearing, because you do need to have a certain degree of subtlety where you like kind of softly manipulate conversations into talking about your work. And aside from that, it's mostly word of mouth. Get connections as soon as possible. Talk to voice actors, talk to artists, talk to certain server owners, get into podcasts. Talk, find platforms where you can talk about yourself and your work and see if people will hire you from that.
And sell yourself. Yeah, absolutely. And on the mention of podcasts, that's exactly what this one is for artists to come on here and sell themselves like pancakes. I've
Yep.
never heard anyone say that, but that is so beautiful. So yeah,
Yeah,
no, I feel you there. That is absolutely the purpose of this, and that's what I hope to create for people is a place that they can go and get their word out there to people who generally wouldn't see it because they aren't on a mainstream platform like YouTube. You know, I mean, everybody can see YouTube, and they might not go to WordPress or any of those other platforms to check you out. But if there's a YouTube video up about you, then they're going to see it because everybody sees them. So that makes
yep.
sense that you would be out there doing that, and I really appreciate you coming on here to do it. As far as the works that you do, how often do you find? I see this with artists, specifically drawing and traditional styles, where somebody will get into them with a project and then they end up ghosting them and it goes nowhere. And this artist has put all this work into it, and now all of a sudden, nothing. So, do you find that with your own works?
As a writer, thankfully, so far I haven't found it. Well, the difference is that if you're writing, there's a certain permanence to your work. Like it takes a lot more. Well, it depends. It's all relative, but I've found that it takes me a lot longer to get a script going than it takes someone to get a drawing going. And thankfully for artists, we can usually just pay up front, like ask for payment up front. And the issue I have run in though is where people ask me for my rates and I give them my rates, which are industry standard, and they go, "Oh, that's way too expensive," because they expect someone to pay $10 for like 5 hours of work. So they kind of
And
ghost you after
no
you give them
matter
their rates.
no matter what artistic discipline you're in, and I'm not saying this to you, I'm saying it just in general, it doesn't matter what it is you do creatively, never undersell yourself because you put time, effort, and your life into the work you do, and you should be compensated for it if you're doing it for somebody else.
Oh yes, absolutely. Like that's the main thing I've always struggled with my well, I used to struggle with my own work, but I now I struggle with friends' works and other people's works. I'm in several writing discords or writing servers. I look into several forums, and usually people are selling themselves at like 3 cents per word, 1 cent per word, which is below minimum wage because it usually takes someone a couple of hours to write even 1,000 words. And if you pay someone a cent per word, you're paying them $10 for 1,000 words of work. I think the industry standard rate right now is I think it's 5 cents per work at the bare minimum. Like if we're talking, if you're an amateur writer who only writes Sonic fan fiction, and for industry standard, it goes up from 10 cents to $1 for like
Per
any kind of
word.
professional work. Yeah, per word.
So when you're
Writing,
at that kind of level, I mean, you do make good money off of what you're doing then.
yeah, and that's the level for your average to advanced writer.
That's fantastic that you have that kind of information readily available. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
Um,
a lot of places, a lot of forums where writers congregate, especially in the professional field, they will tell you, don't undersell yourself. These are the current rates. This is what you should price yourself at, and this is what you should price yourself in the future as you raise your rates.
which is, of course, relative to everybody. I mean, everybody's going to assume that they're worth something else, but having somebody who's experienced it and having a professional tell you that kind of information definitely, I would assume, helps, especially in the amateur sphere where somebody has no idea what it is they should be going for.
Yeah, the only issue comes when people themselves, they're stubborn and they keep like, self-flagellating to the point where they always say like, "Oh no, I'm just not worth the price," which is fine, sure, but I hold the personal opinion that if you need to price yourself below the bare minimum that everyone else is giving you, then maybe you should work on making yourself better before you start selling your art or selling your writing or selling your product.
That makes sense, absolutely, and that's a fantastic tip to anybody who's looking into getting into it. If you don't feel like you're worth the bare minimum of what industry standard is, then maybe you should just spend some more time working on your craft and leveling up your skills essentially and getting to a point to where you do feel that you are worth it.
Yep.
Now, what kind of projects do you generally look for? Is it something like you said you can do all sorts of different things and that you like doing certain things, but what kind of offers tend to come your way, and which ones are the ones that you tend to accept, and which ones are the ones that you tend to just turn away because you have no interest in it?
Honestly, I'm the kind of writer that will do literally anything. I will write anything you want as long as you pay me well for it. So far, the roles I've gotten the most for are writing commissions, which just general story commissions. They ask me for a story. Usually, it's not safe for work, but like they ask me for a story and I write it for them, send it to them, they pay me. Transaction's over. So far, I've had two script writing jobs. One of them is concurrent. The other one has finished at the moment. Both of them are in great environments. I work fast in them, and I'm currently contracted for more script writing jobs at another company.
And is that one of the ones that's under the NDA and thus can't be explained?
Yes, they are.
That's fine.
So I can't really say anything about it. But
No worries,
aside
I
from
won't
that,
touch it.
I'm always free for more writing. I'm always free for more commissions. So whenever, if anyone needs anything done, and I like hell, I even do some lyric work from time to time. I even do some lyric writing because I know minimal music theory. So like, as long as the job needs a writer, and as long as the job is well paid, I will absolutely join it.
Now, you've mentioned NSFW Works, and I've spoken with both Lincoln and Thick Necko, and well, I mean not both, but every episode involves this a little bit. So I'd like to hear it from a writer's perspective. As far as the artistic community goes, it seems like in some ways there's almost a stigma attached to it that when you start drawing things like this, you kind of become known for that, and it's hard to break away from it. Do you find that in writing?
Kind of. Well, so far for for the people that have contracted me, most of them have contracted me for strictly safe for works for like the actual companies that ask me to hire to write scripts for them, which is fine. I like that. Most of my commissions though have been not safe for work. If they haven't been not safe for work, then they have definitely have had a certain mature feel to them, which I prefer, honestly. It gives me more freedom to write. When it comes to writing, when it comes to the stigma of becoming a not safe for work or well an erotic writer, then from what I've seen, the writers tend to avoid that for the most part, because unlike for example, when you become an artist and you know when you become an artist, it becomes way more lucrative to sell not safe for work, whereas where you become a writer, everything you do can be sold. So you can write erotica, and erotica sells really well, like really quickly, because age-old adage. But as long as your writing is good across the board, even if you're only an erotica writer, you can be hired for safe for work works and otherwise.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not like, let's say if you get really good at drawing naked bodies because you're into doing like the fundamentals of anatomy and everything, sure, you could translate that into working on NSFW content, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to take that exact skill set and apply it to a fully designed character in an outfit and everything because you don't have the experience doing, that type of specific drawing.
Yeah.
Whereas with words, I mean, you can string if you're clever and creative and thoughtful, then you can string any words together and create whatever you want. So absolutely, yeah, that makes sense.
The interesting part about that is that while I do agree with that, they are certain separate skill sets to different genres of writing. I would equate erotica more to action writing than I would equate it to romance, actually. Which
Okay,
sounds
explain.
weird. Yeah, it sounds weird, but hear me out. With erotic writing, you need to give the reader a complete sense of scene. You need to tell them exactly what's going on, how it's going on. Like you need to have every single emotion, movement, and dirty juice flying about in a way that the reader can immediately look at the words that are being displayed and imagine it perfectly in their head. Especially more so with erotic writing because they're going to be paying attention and even rereading those words very carefully. This is the exact same thing that happens with good action writing. If you're a good writer that focuses on thrillers or action or like writing that has a lot of movement to it, for example, like say you're a writer that has a story about two swordsmen and you have them fight each other, that skill set is pretty much the exact same as erotic writing. The only difference is language. Think about, like, for example, the seething bed sheets spread over the loin or something, and then compare that with, the sprawling blood flew from his veins as he was struck against the landing. Something like that. Like, it's the same exact of language, whereas with romance, it's more about romance would be equated more towards feeling, towards pure emotion. It's not so much action as it is just the inherent emotions of the human nature, or of humanity. So when it comes to
That
erotic
makes
writing, I
sense.
would say that yeah, if you're an action writer, you're going to translate well. And if you're a romance writer, you're not going to translate well unless you learn first.
Unless you get your fundamentals down, which so far through these conversations with artists of different mediums, I've found that most everybody preaches that fundamentals are key in any endeavor creatively. Um,
Absolutely.
where now, on that note, where would you say you picked your fundamentals up from? In some cases, I find that artists specifically have a mentor that they can mention. Do you have anything like that?
My mentor, I don't really have a mentor because I started writing when I was very young. But if I had to pick a mentor, it was role playing sites back in the day. Um,
Been
when
there.
I when I was 12, I used to get. It started when I was 12, but I did it for like 4 years and then I stopped, and then I started writing like actual writing. But when I was 11 or 12 years old, I joined role playing sites, and they were innocent. Okay, they were innocent role playing sites,
I don't think that
and it
exists.
was they were purely PG 13. At most, you
You
had a
found
bit
a
of gore.
unicorn friend.
I was an RPA, and basically they encouraged me just get in, grab your character, get in, and write out their actions. And every single like people would just get in and they would form these conglomerate stories. And granted, most of them were pretty bad. Okay,
Or
most of them were
cringy.
done by amateur writers who just wanted to get, they just wanted to get some stress out of the day and become a character that they could never be. But some of them were amazing, and I had a couple of particular role plays where my character, like my partner was a really skilled writer, and they told me, okay, how about you try doing this instead of this? Don't make your character a Mary Sue. Don't make your character like too flawless. Give them some flaws. Give them some interesting
Well,
points.
yeah, because
That's
people don't necessarily connect with like a Superman. They connect with somebody who has those type of
yeah,
flaws and can feel the pain of failure. And it's not always about whether or not somebody can do something amazing. It's about whether or not they can fail and get back up and try again. And that type of story really resonates with almost everybody.
yeah, which is why everyone loves Spider-Man. But
Absolutely.
so I would say that's where I got my fundamentals for character. But if I were to talk specifically about fundamentals and what you need to be like, what are the fundamentals you need to learn as a writer? I would probably have to categorize it in a couple of points. Number one is definitely you need to get a hold of basic grammar and vocabulary. Like that's the ever expanding thing. But when I talk about grammar, I also talk about that also extends to formatting and knowing about pacing. Pacing and flow in writing is one of the most difficult things to master, but it is a basic. It is the base in which everything stands upon. A writer with terrible vocabulary but amazing pacing will easily sweep you under the rug faster than a writer that has, an entire lexicon under his belt but has terrible pacing. That's the difference between, say, a story that has amazing language but you can't sit through, and a simple story with very simple language that grabs you and keeps you under its hold. So, like, when it comes to flow, I tend to mostly, in order to make myself improve, I tend to put little challenges when I write. The reason why holding a consistent pacing and a consistent flow is so hard for writers is because we don't read at the same pace as the readers do. We don't consume our own works at the same pace that our readers do. Whereas a reader will just constantly flow through the pages and sometimes even skip some words subconsciously, a writer will meticulously craft every single bit and every single paragraph and even re-edit them time and time again. The issue that this opens up, and the issue that I've seen myself and a lot of amateur writers do back in the day, was what I used to do. I no longer do it, thankfully. Is you used to use a lot of commas, a lot of pauses. You try to dictate the way that the reader's supposed to read your work. That's not something you should do. You should always challenge yourself to, for example, remove unnecessary commas, remove unnecessary pauses, get creative with your wording, try to remove like the usage of he as a starting point, or like he, she, they, or as, if, pronouns and prepositions like that. Another basic of writing I would aside from pacing, which I consider to be the number one, would be mostly you need to start planning out your stories. That's what separates a mediocre writer for a good writer, aside from pacing, in my opinion, is A great writer knows how to plan their stories out, where something that was mentioned in chapter 1 or in episode 1 or what have you can be brought up again later. That also comes under one of the many rules that they'll teach you if you actually go to writing classes is, Chekhov's gun. A gun that's mentioned in chapter 1 will either A, have to go off at the final chapter, B, never go off but be mentioned as a joke, or C, pose a threat. You want
So you
to
need that thing to be involved.
Yeah, you want to always have every single part of your story matter. Even if it's something as simple as fluff text, you want that text to convey something, because even the most basic of exposition can convey something about a character.
So how much time do you spend going back and rereading your own work just to make sure that rule is followed?
Uh, it depends. It depends on the degree of the work, but the way I do things is I usually have a rough draft, and then I have a couple of quick re-edits. Sometimes I pitch in with friends and go like, "Hey, this paragraph seems off to me. Can you help me?" And then I've gone to 3 to 4 rewrites. The most extensive rewrite I've ever done was I had to rewrite a single scene about probably 7 or 8 times because it didn't fit. So I rewrote the entire scene instead of just a couple of paragraphs, which is another challenge that a writer will have to face. Is sometimes the initial draft just won't work, so you'll have to destroy everything and build it back up.
That touches on a point that I've spoken with a few different artists about, especially musicians. A lot of musicians say that some of their best work comes when they don't overthink it and they just kind of let themselves flow from the first initial idea and inspiration into the finished product. Do you find that with writing at all?
I would agree and disagree with writing. It depends, because the issue is that sometimes you do have those moments where you're in the zone and you write everything perfectly, but I still think that you should always go back and proofread, because even though that paragraph might be perfect first go, like the idea will be conveyed perfectly, you can still word it and simplify it. Like
That,
I
and
would
I
write
would
a
say
paragraph. Yeah.
writing would definitely be more of like an extended work rather than a drawing or a piece of music that might last 2, maybe 3 minutes, So I could bet that something, if you do, like, let's go off of the paragraph. If a paragraph is absolutely perfect upon first draft, maybe you do something later on that throws it off and you have to go back and check it out.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe sometimes the next paragraph throws off the flow, so you need to simplify the first one or simplify the second one. It's a constant game of back and forth. And sometimes you have some writers that can just go at it and just finish perfectly first go. Those are very rare, if not non-existent, because a good writer at least, will always know that, hey, there could always be room for more improvement.
It seems like writing is, in a way, a much more introspective art form than from that perspective.
I would definitely say so. I would definitely say that writing is, at the very least, I don't want to say it's the hardest one, because every single art form has its own difficulties, but I would definitely say that out of every single art form I've seen, I think that writing is the most consuming one.
I can understand that. Yeah, you definitely would end up putting quite a bit of time into it, depending on. I mean, for every project, I would assume. I don't do it myself, obviously. I'm not an artist at all, so I can't really speak from experience. But from the way that people talk about it in the interviews that I've done, I would say it sounds like exactly that. Now, when you do when you do your writing, one thing that's been mentioned a couple of times is that there doesn't seem to be really an end goal in sight with art, because just anybody can pick up any type of medium and go wherever they want with it. But on that note, what would you say is something like where would you see yourself in 5 to 10 years with this? Where do you want to go with your art?
Well, when it comes to writing, hopefully in 5 to 10 years, I can either be a published author or be working, as freelance for several projects at a time. That's the dream goal in 5 to 10 years. Uh, the thing I really want to commit myself to, once I finish my current projects, get more projects and whatnot, is I want to start making my own work, so I can start publishing it and be an actual author. for most writers, that's the end goal. Just be an author of your own work, your own book series, or your own short stories, even.
Just to own your art and do your thing, it seems.
Yeah, and more than
But even
anything,
in
to
that, I
have
mean,
others
I
read
would
it.
say with all the subgenres out there of writing, there's so many different options. I mean, anybody can want to be an author, but at the same time, you have to decide if you want to be an action writer, a thriller writer, a horror writer, science fiction, fantasy, whatever. So there's still countless doors open, even with that end goal in sight.
Oh yeah, which I find particularly exciting because that also means that you can just choose whatever. Like even if you're like a published horror writer and you know that your viewers know you for your horror writing, you can branch out into romance or I don't know into action at the flip of a hat. For example, for me, my main story that I want to write revolves. It's a mixture. It's an anthology series, but the main focus of it is between a more of a melancholic, tragic romance between a man and his, deathly ill wife, and how he tells her stories and whatnot. That's my like the main story I want to write. But aside from that, I have a lot of short stories in my mind about science fiction, action, thrillers, a couple of horror shorts here and there. These ideas are constantly floating around, and whenever I want, I can just start writing them.
So now you say that the one that you're most excited to get going on is that tragic story, and you also had mentioned that your influences kind of come around from your daily life and the things going on around you, the art that you consume, all that. What would you say is the influence for that story specifically?
For that story specifically, it's a couple of things, but mostly whenever I've walked like to school every day, or whenever I walk, I go outside and kind of roam around the city. I see myself getting kind of lost, like the landscape. Like I see the world around me, and I start looking at people, and I start imagining little stories for each of them, like what they do next day, what they do that night, what did they eat, how did they eat. They're little quirks and unique little things that make everyone's story worth telling. And then I brought that into this character that I made, who is he's a failed writer, so he's just an office worker at day, but he really cares about his wife, who's mostly bedridden most of the day. So what he does is he does what I do. He looks at the world around him, starts imagining stories from it, starts exaggerating the world around him, then tells her about it.
So, in a way, this story would be inspired by what you would maybe consider potentially the worst case scenario for your own writing career.
Not really. It's mostly inspired by two things. One, my daily musings, and two, mostly my fiance and how I feel about her. It's kind of like that really special connection that makes me want her to tell her every single story that I can think of. And I kind of translate that into paper, as well as a
That's
bunch of
beautiful.
dreams that I've had. Yeah.
I really hope that I get a chance to read that when it comes out. That sounds like a fantastic project and something
Yeah.
that you're really into the idea of. So, you definitely seem like you've got the passion to make it happen.
Yeah.
Is writing something that you do full time? Have you managed to break into the sphere of where you're strictly making money off of your creativity, or is it something that you have to do part time currently until you get to that point?
Well, at the moment, I'm trying to break into full-time writing. At the moment, it's not really a possibility since I basically just started. But it's also because mostly time management. I'm trying to get finished with school so I can either get a job and do writing part-time or focus completely on writing and try to get contracted as quickly as possible.
How would you go about doing that?
It's the same thing. I'm making connections right now, networking all over the place, appearing in podcasts.
Do that leg
Uh,
work, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I got to do a lot of legwork, and if it works, then I might be able to go into contracted full-time writing job, writing work like immediately. If it doesn't, then there's always the backup plan of, go find a part-time or a full-time job and write on the side.
I actually had this same kind of conversation with Chase just a moment ago as far as music goes. His philosophy on it was, if you do push yourself out there, maybe, and it doesn't succeed, maybe it was that you just weren't ready for it. Maybe you need to kind of step back a little bit, like you were saying with monetize or with valuing your art. just step back and kind of grow yourself artistically and get to a point to where maybe those opportunities will start coming to you. Now, you've also expressed that you like to get yourself out there and sell your work and sell yourself. So, at what point do you feel like those two things collide, and on which side do you feel you personally land more on as far as the philosophy goes?
Personally, I believe that you should always be looking for more stuff to do. So even though I do agree that you should sometimes take a step back and kind of better yourself, I also believe that once you get to a certain point where you can value your work and actually start working, I think that even if you do have those times where you have to step back and work, a daily office job or something like that, you should always be looking for that next big thing, always putting yourself out there, especially with writing, because writing is something that can be done on the side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that you can do almost at any time, especially with the accessibility of technology. I can imagine that a lot of writers use things like voice dictation to just go ahead and get ideas down while they're in the midst of doing something else.
Yeah, small outlines on notes. I take my phone everywhere, so I just start writing on my phone whenever I get that
Do you
inspiration going.
actually write, or do you vocalize it?
I write. I do not like the vocalization because it is very iffy, and I like to constantly delete things, so it would be a pain to constantly getting over.
Okay, that makes
So
sense. It
I
kind of
just
sets it a
I
little bit more in stone than you're comfortable with.
yeah, so I just take my phone and I open Google Docs and I just start writing.
Which that's a fantastic platform. I've been using it personally, and it's wonderful how much access it gives you across different or not platforms, devices, and it's nice to be able to put something up somewhere and then grab it from somewhere else because you're contextually just working in a different way. So,
Oh yeah, it's great
uh,
because it means that I can work at home and then bring my homework to the outside whenever I go out, if I ever need to go out. It also means that like whenever you go to the bathroom, you can still type on your phone.
I'm sure some people's best writing happens there.
I mean, that's the place. That's the place where inventions are made, man.
I don't doubt that at all. So, as far as technology goes, a lot of the different disciplines of the people that I've been talking to, I mean, as far as art goes, especially in the digital realm, that stuff is not cheap. If you want to get a good drawing tablet, you've got to shell out a couple $100s. If you want to be a musician, you've got to buy instruments, you've got to buy mixers, sound recorders, all these things. What kind of experiences do you have in that field with writing? Do you find that you have to purchase certain things, or do you just, I mean, when it comes down to it, can you just do it on a pad of paper with a pencil?
Not in the slightest. Honestly, all you really need to be a writer nowadays is you need a computer or a phone, some internet, and some place to put yourself in. That's pretty much all you need. Sometimes you don't even need the computer because certain companies will just take like manuscripts that you write with your own hands. So from what
So
I've
there's a
seen, all
little
I've
bit more
ever really needed.
accessibility there.
Yeah, there's a lot more of accessibility, but it also comes with the fact that the field is very complex.
I mean, as
Which is,
far as creativity goes, it seems like all the fields are just absolutely saturated with content
oh
now.
yeah,
And that's not
it's
necessarily
insane.
a bad thing, I would say. I would say, in a way, it's kind of beautiful because everybody has that access to be that next big thing because anybody can get out there and get seen. So
I
I'm
actually,
sure. Go
I
ahead.
had that conversation. I had a conversation with my classmates a couple of days ago, or well, a couple of weeks ago, where I was trying to like we're in philosophy, so I was trying to tell them like, do you guys think? Do you guys feel that classics no longer exist? Like you no longer look at a movie or a film or a piece of music or whatever, and you say, "Oh, that's an instant classic." Whereas before, like video games, movies, media in general, people would look at them and say, "Oh, that movie's amazing. It's an instant modern classic," and they were agreeing with me, and they were saying like, "Oh yeah, there are no more classics," and I was like, I think that's wrong, because I think that we're producing the same quality of work, if not even better than we used to. The difference is that we have so much amazing work put out there that everything becomes a blur. Whereas
Well,
before
I
you used
wouldn't
to
say
get,
that there's no such thing as a classic anymore, but it's more on an individual scale. It's not like,
yeah,
there's one Disney movie that gets released and everybody's like, oh my God, Beauty and the Beast is the best thing ever. We're going to watch that for 30 years. Now you can just go on YouTube and you can watch anybody animating things, and it might not be the
yeah,
same quality, but it might resonate with you on a deeper level.
yeah. We have so much content nowadays that anything can be considered a classic, really. And the things that are considered classics, they kind of lose that luster because there's so much good stuff out there, which I find it's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time.
It does seem like a bad thing on the aspect that, as far as rewatching things and being a constant in people's lives, like, I don't think there's ever going to be another Nightmare Before Christmas. That movie holds such a giant place in my heart. I know every lyric to it. I'm such a massive fan of everything involved with it. But I don't think anybody's ever going to, produce something that's going to hit me that same way, as well as millions of other people. But there's plenty of content that hits me, and it becomes my personal favorite. And it might not reach
Yeah,
out to those millions, but for me, it means something.
yeah. It's a whole conversation about the oversaturation of media, but in the modern world, and especially when it comes to art and writing, it means that it's harder to get noticed, but it also means that when you do get noticed, it means a lot more.
Yeah, it really matters. That's a fantastic viewpoint. I'm glad that I got to have this conversation. That's a wonderful. I love, one of my favorite things here is that I'm getting viewpoints from things that I never would have thought of. Like, you're a writer, so you have this whole thought process going through it that I just never would have even thought to begin, because of your lived experience and the way you do your art and the types of creativity that you put out there for the world. And I've noticed that I'm coming across that quite often with digital and traditional artists as well as musicians, and that's fantastic. I really appreciate how you guys kind of enlighten me to these things based off of your opinions.
Well, hopefully we can enlighten a lot more people.
That's the goal. That is the goal. We'll see whether or not it happens, but that is the goal.
Yeah.
I'd like to get to where, I mean, I keep mentioning it in each one of the different recordings, but at this point, I'm just grateful for everybody who comes and allows me to pick their brain like this, because at the moment, I have nothing to offer you. I have no following. I can't tell you that you're going to get commission sales off of this or get any work. But as I'm going, I'm getting more likely for that to happen. So I hope that one day I build a platform where I can bring an artist on and help them create that dream of doing, writing full time, art full time, music full time. I'd
Well,
love to be the person who facilitates that.
well, the way I see it right now, this is an investment. So I'm investing some time. I'm enjoying the conversation, and in return, this might be a good way to showcase that I'm here. This is me. Hire me.
Exactly. Hire him. The links will all be in the description. If you've made it this far, hire this lad.
Yeah. So, anything else you wanna ask me about?
No, I mean, we pretty much covered everything I've had. Now, one thing I would like to say in closing is, at the ends, I've been enjoying giving the person who's guesting an opportunity to give pointers to people up and coming. I know you've covered a couple, but is there any final thoughts that you would give somebody who's just starting out and just learning about how
Mm,
to get to the position that you're in?
someone who's starting out in writing. If aside from the pointers that I've given, sell yourself, whatever, um, talk to people. Definitely talk to people. Grab people and tell them, "Hey, I wrote this. Can you check it out?" But more than anything, take those criticisms that they give you to heart. A lot of people are going to tell you that your writing's bad. Or a lot of people are going to tell you that your writing is good. Grab bits and pieces off of all of them and make yourself better. If you have a problem with pacing, try to fix it. If someone tells you, "Hey, I don't like this sentence," try to find out why. You need to constantly improve as a writing because the market is getting more and more competitive every day. But more than anything, it's so that you can tell your stories in the best way possible.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time. It's
Thank
been
you
a
for having me.
fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. These 40-something minutes have just flown by.
Yes, they have.
So, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and bring it to a close, and I hope you have a beautiful day.
Sure thing.